Let's talk about common method bias, specifically what it is, why it's important, how it can be mitigated in research survey design, and then also how it is that it can be statistically evaluated or controlled for. The seminal article regarding common method variance is published by Podsakoff et al. In 2003, and this appears in the Journal of Applied Psychology. Now, I want to point out that there's a number of outstanding papers that focus on common method variance. What I've chosen to do is select the Podsakoff article to go over because I think it's an excellent article. It's a very highly cited article, and also because it's very comprehensive. As I'm talking, I will introduce some additional papers that I think are worth exploring, and I'll also introduce some of my experiences with common method variance. The structure of the talk is going to be an overview of what common method variance is, why it's an issue, what leads to common method variance, procedural remedies that can be used to reduce it, and then statistical remedies that can be used to evaluate and then control for it. Common method variance is variance that's attributable to the measurement method rather than the constructs that the measures represent. So it's variance that's due to how it was that the data was collected rather than to the actual or true relationships between the constructs and the items. Common method variance is important because it has a potential to influence the significance, so the p-value, the magnitude, the effect size, and then also the direction of coefficients. Common method variance can make it much more difficult to determine whether an observed relationship or a relationship that's not been observed actually occurs in reality. This is often important to indicating whether hypotheses were supported or not supported. But common method variance can also make it difficult to determine whether an effect size is meaningful in reality. So it's not just about whether a relationship is significant, but it's about the strength of that relationship. If the effect size is large, then it means that there's more meaningful relationship there. And so concerns about common method variance are major and often listed as a major reason why rejection occurs at top-tier journals. To help you better understand what common method variance is and why it's problematic, I want to give you a simple example. So assume that you've surveyed hundreds of professors like me who choose not to change their profile pictures for 20-some years, and you've asked them at one point in time to complete a number of different items, evaluating things like persistence, intelligence, reading, brand advocacy of, let's say, McDonald's, and then job performance. And that you've asked these professors to evaluate each one of those items, or each one of these constructs, using 7 items, each of which are anchored with a strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. If you do that, what you're likely to do is see an inflation between the correlations of your independent and your dependent variable. So persistence, intelligence, reading, job performance, all of these things are things that we would want to be very good at. And so it's likely that we're going to rate ourselves as being very high in those things, higher than we really might be. And also with brand advocacy, for McDonald's, we might find some relationship there between with performance, and not necessarily because there's a relationship there in reality, but possibly because we've measured those items using the same person, and also because we're using this. So let's talk about the extent of CMV and why it's problematic. Well, as the Podsakoff article highlights, Coate and Buckley, they found that approximately 25% of the variance in measures can be attributed to systematic sources of measurement bias, including common method variance. So it's very prevalent, and those findings were replicated by Williams et al. There's also a large number of studies, as Potskoff et al. Point out, that show that common method variance not only affects the significance, but the magnitude of relationships between variables, and can alter the amount of variance that's explained in the dependent variable by a large degree. Now, although I'm making a big issue of common method variance, and I think it is, I do want to point out that there's another side to this story. Research by Floor et al. In Journal of Business Research point out that high levels of common method variance are needed to materially bias relationships, and therefore common method variance might not be as much of a concern as researchers and editors and reviewers are making it out to be. And I think that there's probably quite a bit of truth to Fuller and all statements. I certainly agree with those, but the reality is to publish in the top tier journals today, you need to show that common method variance is not a problematic issue. One way that you can do that is by introducing interaction effects, some moderation effects. And that's because research suggests that those interaction effects cannot result from common method variance. So if you have a significant interaction effect in your model, it can provide evidence to reviewers and editors that common method variance is not problematic, especially with regard to that finding. So what leads to this common method variance? Well, there's a number of different things. One is that your independent and your dependent variables are measured using the same person. People have a tendency to try to be consistent. So if I'm going to respond to this set of items in this particular way, I'm likely to respond to a similar set of items in a consistent way, even though different constructs might be represented there. There's also a social desirability bias, so our desire to respond in a way that we think is socially pleasing, so that's going to make us look good. There's acquiescence bias, which is our bias to sort of go along with what's being suggested. And also mood, right? If you're in a positive mood, you might respond to items differently than if you were in a negative mood. And all of these factors have the ability to influence the relationships between items and constructs in your data. There's also measurement items that can influence common method bias. And that's because those items themselves might convey there's something desirable about them that should result in respondents responding in a certain way. They can also include common anchors, which don't really result in respondents thinking about those items as deeply as they might if they were different SCAL anchors. So anchors being something like strongly disagree to strongly agree, or like, dislike, etc. Item ambiguity, so when respondents don't understand what it is that's being asked of them, they're likely to impose their own view on that particular item or respond to it in a way that they've responded to somewhat similar items or items close by. And then also if there's a lot of positive items or negative items in your data, you're likely to see higher levels of common method variance because of mood, etc., that those types of items can provoke. Survey design structure itself. So items can influence how it is that other items are responded to. So, tie back into a little bit with mood, if I'm asking some negative questions, then what it is that's being asked next might be influenced by potentially a negative mood that's prompted by those items. The survey length itself, so if I'm using a lot of items in my survey, it's going to take respondents a longer time to complete that survey, and as a result they might read each item a little bit less extensively, they might become fatigued, they might rush through to get it done, and as a result I might not necessarily be capturing true relationships between the items and constructs. And then also when and where the items themselves are measured can influence the common method variance. So when there's time between measuring items, I can reduce common method variance because I'm limiting the effect of mood. And I'm also making it more difficult for respondents to accurately guess what it is that's being evaluated. I can also change the location at which items are measured in order to prompt different mindsets through which to evaluate the data. And also I can use different mediums for measuring items. So I can make phone calls to respondents. I can have them complete part of a survey online, part of it offline, etc. But changing things up is going to result in lower levels of common method variance. So to continue on with some of the procedural remedies, so I can collect my independent and dependent variables from different sources. So maybe I'll collect all of my independent variables from the respondent themselves, and maybe the dependent variable from their boss, or maybe I'll look at an objective measure that, like their sales performance. If they're a salesperson, I might even survey the customers that they serve to get an idea as to their performance. I can also collect my independent, my dependent variables as highlighted at different times or using different approaches. I can introduce different scal anchors in order to change things up and reduce the amount of common method variance. I can ensure anonymity, which is going to result in lower levels of social desirability bias. And then I can also make sure that my items are really clear, that they're simple, that they're not going to generate any type of confusion, and that each item only asks one question. Pre-testing items is a very important to reducing the amount of confusion, to identifying and eliminating revising items, etc. But that being said, it's not always possible to remove all of the common method variance from data, and so you oftentimes will evaluate the extent of common method variance and then try and find ways to statistically control for it. I'm going to provide some links to some videos that do a really great job of showing you how to apply some of these statistical remedies, but let me give you an overview of what each of these are. So what Harmon's single factor test does is look at the ability of a single construct to explain the amount of variance in the data. So if we're assessing, let's say, 3 different latent constructs, what I can do is I can compare the fit of a model for those 3 constructs with the fit of a model that assumes that all of those items that were used to evaluate those constructs are going to load on one factor, and then use things like a chi-square test comparison to give me an idea as to whether the 3-factor model is a better overall model than the single factor model. We can use partial correlation procedures. So what we can do is we can measure things like effect or social desirability, and then we can partial out the relationship between our independent variable and our dependent variable that's due to that effect or that social desirability bias. We can see then if it's still significant, that's evidence that a real relationship is there. We can look in the change of the magnitude to get an idea as the extent of the common method variance that influence that relationship, etc. We can use a marker variable. So a marker variable is a variable that's supposed to be theoretically unrelated to our construct of interest. So as an example, I could look at water quality, or I could look at maybe something like shoe size if I was looking at behavioral variables, and then partial out any type of relationship that was due to water quality or shoe size in the relationship between our independent and our dependent variable. Okay, to get a better idea as to the extent of common method variance and whether the relationship is significant with or without it. And then also I can look at something like a general factor score and partial that out. So I can go through and complete Harmon's single factor test. I can capture the variance that's due to that single factor and then partial that out from the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable to determine whether it still exists, etc. And then lastly, what I can do, and this is very common in structural models, is control for the effect of a latent measured or an unmeasured variable. So I can measure something like general effect or social desirability or a marker variable, and then I can partial out by including it in a path on our dependent variable to get a better idea as to the real relationship between the independent or the dependent variable. I can also use a phantom variable, which is an unmeasured variable, in order to partial out some of that variance.